There are many people who dream of becoming an artist, a writer, a musician, or maybe a filmmaker, but most don't make it in their desired art form. It's a challenging feat, and only a lucky few can create art for a living. The 10 people we're looking at in the video today are incredibly talented and creative, and worked at the same boring job for years. The lucky ones found fame and recognition late in their lifetime, while the others only received recognition after their death. This video could be a lesson to a struggling artist, because you never know when someone will appreciate the true value of your work. Carry on, don't give up your passion, but maybe don't quit your day job. Number 10. Don Dohler. Don Dohler was a notable community newspaper reporter and editor in the Baltimore area for over 20 years. But before that, his life changed forever on his 30th birthday in 1976. He was working as a payroll clerk when the business was robbed and Dohler was held at gunpoint. It was at this moment when he realized that he wanted to make movies. Dohler worked on 11 movies. He produced, wrote, and edited 10 of them and directed 7 of them. The movies were ultra-low-budget horror and sci-fi films, all of which featured a lot of blood and a little bit of nudity, although Dohler was always uncomfortable with the latter. His flicks were often distributed to the world through direct-to-video and cable companies, which bought his films at an incredibly cheap rate. While his stuff was cheesy, his movies had a drive and a charm about them that viewers found appealing. From 1978 to 2004, he developed a following, and his fans included famed director John Waters, who compared him to Ed Wood, and J.J. Abrams, who saw his movies as a kid and was influenced by Dohler's do-it-yourself attitude to filmmaking. Don Dohler showed that a good movie just needs a lot of imagination and even more passion. Dohler passed away on December 2, 2006 at the age of 60. His last movie, Dead Hunt, was released shortly thereafter. Number 9. Charles Ives. To many people who knew Charles Ives, he was a successful actuary who owned an insurance company. He was a very forward-thinking businessman. Ives was one of the key figures in the burgeoning field known as estate planning. However, on the side, Ives composed radical classical music and even paid musicians to perform it. Born in 1874, he studied music at Yale and was a talented pianist. In about 1900, he started composing music that was just a little too different for contemporary listeners. For example, he allowed the musicians to play freestyle at certain times and he used excerpts from other well-known songs. He also mixed genres, and all of this made his songs quite polarizing when they were released. Charles Ives would eventually retire from both music and insurance. It wasn't until his last few years that his music started to get some recognition. One of his major awards was the 1948 Pulitzer Prize for Music, which he won for Symphony No. 3. But it wasn't until after his death in 1954 that the true talent of Ives was appreciated, and he's now considered a musical genius who was way ahead of his time. World-renowned art school Juilliard played his music over the course of 6 days on the 50th anniversary of his death. Number 8. Anvil. Formed in 1978 and releasing their first album in 1981, Anvil is a Canadian heavy metal band who counts Motorhead, Slash, Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax as fans. What set them apart from the rest of the metal bands at the time was just how heavy they sounded. During the 1980s, they even toured with some of the biggest rock bands of all time, including Bon Jovi, the Scorpions, and Whitesnake. A lot of people, including vocalist-guitarist Steve Lips-Kudlow and drummer Rob Reiner, thought it was just a matter of time before they blew up. Instead, they watched all the bands around them find fame and fortune while they were left to the realm of never was. In 2005, Lips and Reiner were turning 50, but still played in the band, although mostly at their neighborhood bar. Then Lips got an email from a European fan saying she could set up a tour where they would get paid €1,500 per show. The band, along with a documentary filmmaker, traveled to Europe and experienced a completely disastrous tour, very much like Spinal Tap. Also, like Spinal Tap, Anvil travels to Japan at the end to find redemption when they discover a legion of fans. All of this is encapsulated in the documentary Anvil, the story of Anvil. The documentary is a critically acclaimed film about friendship and never giving up on your dreams. After the documentary was released, Anvil finally achieved worldwide fame. Number 7. Charles Bukowski. Novelist and poet Charles Bukowski was hailed for his realism when writing about the dead-end lives of his characters, including his alter ego, Henry Chinsicki. One of the reasons he so aptly depicted their lives was that for most of his own life, Bukowski worked at a number of boring and dead-end jobs. Bukowski quit college after his second year and moved to New York to try to get a career as a writer. However, after only getting a few short stories published, Bukowski's literary career didn't quite take off like he was hoping, so he got a job as a a mail carrier and later moved back to his hometown of Los Angeles. There, he worked as a dishwasher, drove a truck, and finally took a job as a post office clerk. During his time at his boring day jobs, he continued to contribute his column, Notes of a Dirty Old Man, to a few underground newspapers, and he published a number of poetry collections. Finally, at the age of 49, Bukowski decided it was time to restart his writing career. He was offered $100 a month to write full-time for the independent publisher Black Sparrow Press. A month after quitting his job with the mail service, he completed his first novel, Post Office. He went on to publish 6 other novels, dozens of poetry collections, and a number of short story anthologies later in his life. Ever since he quit the post office, his work has been immensely popular and incredibly influential on many different levels of pop culture. Most notably, Tom Waits cites Bukowski as one of his major influences, and U2 dedicated a song to him. Bukowski's alter ego, Henry Chinsicki, has twice been depicted in film, once by Mickey Rourke in Barfly and once by Matt Dillon in Factotum. Hank Moody from Californication is also inspired by Bukowski. Bukowski is an amazing example of how it's never too late to give up everything and follow your dreams. He died at the age of 73 after publishing his final novel, Pulp, in 2004. Number 6. Herman Melville. For decades, English students have had to suffer through the classic novel Moby Dick. While it's a tough read, it's also a rich and complex morality tale about how obsession can destroy someone. It's a novel that's resonated with people and is one of the most famous American novels of all time. As such, one would think that the author, Herman Melville, would have been quite well off from all of the profits. However, Moby Dick, it wasn't popular at the time. In fact, he made more money with his novel Typee, A Peep at Polynesian Life, about his experiences as a captive on an island in the South Pacific, than he did off Moby Dick. That book sold over 16,000 copies, while Moby Dick only sold 3,700. His other books were even less successful. Melville, he didn't chase the elusive white whale known as fame and fortune, and instead he got a job as a deputy inspector of customs at the Port of New York in 1886. He worked there for the next 29 years, retiring at the age of 66. He died 6 years later in 1891. It wasn't until 1920 that Moby Dick was rediscovered, and today it's hailed as an iconic classic of American literature. Number 5. Vivian Maier. Vivian Maier worked for almost 40 years as a nanny, but everywhere she went, she brought her camera with her. On her time off, she went around Chicago and took street shots, some of which are quite stunning and capture everyday city life in the 1950s and 60s. But she never really showed anyone her work, and no one knew that she was such a talented and prolific photographer until days after her death. At an estate sale, realtor John Maloof bought a box of negatives for $400. He was co-writing a book on Portage Park and was looking for old pictures of the neighborhood. There weren't any in the box, but he was amazed at how good the pictures were. He went back to the auction company, found out they had more boxes, and bought them all, amassing a collection of over 100,000 negatives. A few months later, he scanned the pictures and posted them on the internet, unsure who the photographer was. Maloof finally came across an envelope in one of the boxes that had the name Vivian Maier. He googled her name, but only found an obituary. Maier had died days before at the age of 83. Her pictures would go on to be in dozens of exhibitions in the United States, Europe, and Asia. 4 books have been released, and she's been the subject of 2 documentaries. Number 4. Henry Darger. In 1908, at the age of 16, Henry Darger began working as a custodian at a Chicago hospital. There he worked for almost 53 years, only leaving for a little while to serve in the army during World War I. Besides being a custodian, he worked up to the position of dishwasher and finally wrapped bandages. Darger would attend Mass every day, sometimes going to as many as 5 services a day. Every day he would then go home to his apartment, where he mostly kept to himself. He lived a solitary life with few friends and no living family members. This could be the reason no one knew about Darger's prolific art projects. In 1972, he was forced to move out of his apartment due to failing health. When his apartment was being cleaned out, an amazing discovery was made. They found Darger's book, which was titled The Story of the Vivian Girls in what is known as the realms of the unreal of the Glan-Deco-Angelinian war storm caused by the Child Slave Rebellion. Whew, quite a title. It was an astonishing 15,145 single-spaced pages long, making it one of the longest works of writing in human history. He also drew hundreds of pictures and watercolors as illustrations of the story, and he wrote over 8,000 pages for a sequel, plus another 5,000 pages of a manuscript which starts off as an autobiography before going on to be a story about a tomato. The story itself is hard to explain because of how expansive his work was, but basically it's about 7 little girls called the Vivian Girls and their one brother. They are often isn't depicted naked, although the novel is not erotic. Instead, the manuscript is incredibly violent. The story is about a rebellion against the evil John Manley and the Glandolinians, who enslave children and often kill and torture them in vivid detail. He appears to have been inspired by his desire to protect abused and neglected children. After his death, his work was studied by scholars and his artwork can be found in galleries across the world. Number 3. Harvey Pekar. Born in 1939, Harvey Pekar lived in the Cleveland area his whole life. He dropped out of college after 1 year and had a few odd jobs before ending up as a file clerk at the Veterans Administration Hospital. He worked there until his retirement in 2001. Sounds pretty dull, right? Well, maybe, but Pekar is one of the most celebrated underground comic book writers of all time. His autobiographical comic, American Splendor, is about how hard everyday life can be. The comic got its start when Pekar drew stick figures and pitched the idea to his friend, comic book artist Robert Crumb. Intrigued, Crumb began drawing for him and was the artist for the first issue in 1976. Pekar continued publishing American Splendor with different artists, and it gained a notable following. In 1987, an anthology of American Splendor was released to critical acclaim, winning an American Book Award. Things only got bigger for Pekar, and he became a regular guest on The Late Show with David Letterman. However, he was banned after his third interview, which is considered the most awkward moment in Late Show history. Pekar started a rant about General Electric, and Letterman tried to get him to stop because at the time, late night was owned by NBC, whose parent company is GE. The exchange between Pekar and Letterman only got more uncomfortable from there. In 2003, American Splendor was made into a movie starring Paul Giamatti. The movie is partly an adaptation of American Splendor and partly a documentary about Pekar. The film was loved by critics, winning a number of awards at film festivals, including Cannes and Sundance. It was also nominated for an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. Through his rise to fame, Pekar maintained the exact same clerical job that he started in his early 20s. He was offered promotions, but he turned them down. He continued to publish American Splendor while in retirement, releasing the last volume in September of 2008 and his last collected edition in 2009. Pekar passed away on July 2, 2010, at the age of 70. Number 2. Sixto Rodriguez. Born in 1942 and raised in Detroit, Sixto Rodriguez was a folk musician who released 2 albums and toured twice in Australia. However, after poor record sales, he was dropped by his label, which itself folded a short time after. After that, Rodriguez quit the music industry. He bought an old house in Detroit at an auction for $50. He worked in demolition and line work throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. The thing is that in South Africa, Rodriguez was apparently as big as Elvis. His records had gone platinum, and some of his songs were considered anthems of the anti-apartheid movement. But none of his fans knew anything about him, and the story emerged that sometime in the 1970s, Rodriguez had killed himself on stage. The documentary Searching for Sugar Man details how 2 Cape Town men tried to figure out what happened to him. Rodriguez, it turned out, he was alive and well and living in the same house. He didn't find out about his fame until 1997 when his daughter found a website about him. After the revelation, he went and played 6 shows in South Africa. Searching for Sugar Man would go on to win an Academy Award for Best Documentary in 2013, only increasing Rodriguez's popularity. Rodriguez is currently 72 and still lives in the same house that he bought all those years ago, despite the increase in album sales. Number 1. Anna Mary Robertson Moses. Born on September 7, 1860 in upstate New York, Anna Marie Robertson started working as a servant for a wealthy family at the age of 12. When she was 27, she married a man who worked on the farm, and the couple saved up their money to buy their own land. They bought their first farm in 1887 before settling down in Eagle Bridge, New York. Together, they ran the farm, and the couple had 10 children, with only 5 surviving. In 1927, her husband died, and Grandma Moses, as she came to be called, took over running the farm until 1936. In her retirement, the 78-year-old found out that after years of hard labor, she could no longer do her favorite activity, embroidery. As a replacement, someone suggested that she take up painting. Thus began her impressive career as a prolific folk artist. Most of her paintings were of rural New England, where Grandma Moses had lived for most of her life. Often she sold her paintings for a few dollars, but then she started to get more and more popular, and her paintings garnered $800 to $1,000 apiece. At the peak of her fame, she was featured in the New York Museum of Modern Art before having her own solo show that went on to break records for attendance. She even received the Women's National Press Club trophy from President Harry Truman in 1949. On her 100th birthday, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller named it Grandma Moses Day, and she appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Moses continued to paint until her death at the ripe old age of 101 in 1961, leaving an amazing legacy behind her. Her painting 4th of July is displayed in the White House, and it was also made into a commemorative stamp in 1969. In 2006, her painting, Sugaring Off, sold for $1.3 million. Not bad for a senior citizen who took up painting as a hobby. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. And if you like these kind of stories about people, do check out our other channel called Biographics. It's biographies of people, if you couldn't guess from the name of the channel. So find a link to that on the screen as well as below this video. And as always, thank you for watching.